Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining me in this recording today about busting pet food myths, one of my very favourite subjects. Thank you so much for Purina for giving me the time and the space to create this talk, but I should let you know that they had absolutely nothing to do with the input or any of the contents either. They just gave me free rein and I have really enjoyed writing it and I hope you enjoy watching it. Let's get going. So here are the myths that we're going to learn about today. So dogs or wolves? You can judge a pet food by its ingredients list. You can see ingredients come up quite a lot because I do find that they are some very common myths that often get misconstrued. Cats can't digest carbohydrates. There's a lot to get through. I hope you, like I say, enjoy it. So first of all, though, I'd better tell you who I am. So my name is Kat, and I'm a small animal veterinary surgeon. I graduated from Bristol Veterinary School in the UK quite a while ago now, so I've dropped the date on there. But I've always worked in first opinion small animal practice, and I have always been very passionate about two things. One, communicating with pet owners, working with them as a team to help their pets, and making sure, as much as I possibly can, that they understand their pets' problems and that they are educated and on board with the treatment and the plans that we have, because I can't do my job unless they're giving the medicines and helping at home as well. And also I'm incredibly passionate about this profession and the people in it. I think veterinary professionals are fantastic, amazing, knowledgeable, skilled, caring individuals who are absolutely brilliant, and I really hope that I can be a positive voice for us in the online space, because that of course is where I am. I started blogging again to sort of increase the amount of knowledge that I could be able to direct my clients to in 2010, and then I started social media pages as Kat the Vet in 2012 to continue on that. And because of that being in the online space, one of the things I have ended up quite passionate about is pet food. Because if you are in any sort of online space about animals, if you're discussing pets in any way, what we feed them comes up. And I expressed my opinions, the science, ended up, sometimes getting some pushback on that, and then went and educated myself about pet food and the evidence base that we have, because obviously it comes up and I really want to be able to give the right information out in the public space. So I hold no nutritional qualifications, but I am very passionate about this subject, and particularly as it pertains to speaking to pet owners. So let's get going. So let's bust some myths, because of course there are a huge amount of opinions online about pet food, but sadly very few of those come from very qualified sources. Everybody feeds their pets. Most people have made gone through some sort of decision-making process before they choose what to feed their pets. And so of course they have opinions on pet food, and that's absolutely fine. You're allowed to have opinions on pet food. But there are some very strong opinions which I find aren't always quite accurate. And there's an enormous amount of pet nutritionists online as well. But what's really important to recognise is pet nutritionist is not a protected term. You don't have to do any learning or education to call yourself a pet nutritionist. You can do some courses online to call yourself a pet nutritionist, but unfortunately an enormous amount of those are not very good quality, and I think people are being taken in by these courses and being told that they can then take this course and educate on pet food or even formulate diets, which really isn't the case. But then our clients are receiving this information online. Pet owners are getting this information online from people who might think they know what they're talking about, or people who have quite strong opinions, but unfortunately they're not always correct. And it's really important that we're able to answer them as veterinary professionals, because there is this myth, this rumour that vet professionals don't know or care about nutrition in animals. Of course, neither of those things are true and could not be further from the truth, really. But the online space, as I know personally, can be quite combative, particularly when it comes to pet foods. And I think that it can be hard to stand up and give an opinion or add to the debate, particularly if that opinion is not aligning with popular opinion, even if popular opinion might not be quite accurate. So it can be very hard, but I would hope that after this talk I might give you a little bit more confidence to have those conversations, because I think our voice is lacking in that online space. It is hard to poke your head above the parapet and say, I'm a vet professional and this is what I think, or this is what I feed my animals, because the pushback sometimes can not always be very nice. But I think that our voice is missing, and that is what is giving this impression that we don't know or we don't care. And obviously then, when we've got our clients in clinic, that's where we really make the most difference, but like I say, a lot of these conversations aren't happening in practice, and sometimes I think we need to go and meet people where they're at, and that is in the online space. And these myths that I'm going to discuss can be applied to all kinds of pet foods. We're not picking out any formulations here, we're not picking out any brands, no companies. We're talking about everybody in this space, and that's really important as well. So myth number 1, dogs are wolves. No, they are not. And this often goes along with things like phraseology like species appropriate diet, ancestral diet, biologically appropriate diet. But what all these things are, including the myth that dogs are wolves, is an appeal to nature fallacy. This is natural, so therefore it must be best. We must go to what nature does and follow that exactly. But of course, we've bettered nature in so many ways as humans, and also therefore as our animals. You know, vaccines are not natural, parvovirus is. One of the reasons that dogs have such large litters of puppies is very few of those are expected to survive to adulthood. And when it comes to nature, all nature really wants is for you to survive, to reproduce, and then she's pretty much done. You know, a wildlife is not something always to be that shouldn't be an ambition. We should be informed by nature and listen to nature, but we should not follow her exactly. You know, in a species appropriate diet, what do these phrases actually mean? So species appropriate diet is just a diet that's appropriate for the species, but dogs as a species are not wolves. Dogs are very different, as we're going to come to. An ancestral diet, that again feeds into these our ancestors, but again, wolves are ancestors, and you know, we shouldn't really be trying to emulate a supernatural diet, because there's no such thing as a species appropriate, ancestral, biological appropriate diet in the wild. What in the wild is a species survival diet. They eat what they can to survive. And dogs and cats in particular are really great at surviving, very adaptable, can live off all kinds of different foods and different sources of nutrition. And that's one of the reasons why as species they're so numerous and so successful. And also why we can feed them such a wide variety of man-made foods, and that they can do so well on them. And what's appropriate for their biology? Well, we know what's appropriate for their biology because we've done an enormous amount of research to be able to create a genuinely species ideal diet in lots of different formats. So when you see phrases like this, just be aware that actually they're marketing terms. They're pertaining to the dogs as wolves or dogs as natural animals myths. And although, you know, they sound great, they're not something that we should be hugely enamored by. So why aren't dogs wolves? Let's dive a little bit deeper into that. So the wild wolf that we have today is not our dogs are not their ancestor. Our dogs are their cousins. They came from a common ancestor, and they developed from that ancestor tens of thousands, possibly even well over 100,000 years ago. The dates vary because there was probably several domestication events across the world over time, because, you know, it kind of makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Prehistoric man saw these wolves. They were probably hanging around their settlement. The puppies were cute. The wolves were kind of good at hunting, and they were like, okay, we could team up, we could get together. And it's such a good idea. I think it probably happened quite a few times. But you know, the wolves we have today are not the direct, you know, our dogs are not their direct descendants. And our dogs differ genetically from wolves in 2 key ways, and they have had a long time to do this. So there has been a little bit of evolution. The wolves kept themselves to themselves, the dogs came with humans, and we have changed each other. First of all, our dogs are sociable. So the intertwinement between the canine species and the human species is absolutely fantastic. You know, we understand each other, we communicate with each other, and what we have ended up creating over tens of thousands of years is dogs that literally cannot live without humans. You know, their ability to survive without us is not actually that great, and their need to survive with us is huge. Truly feral populations of dogs that want absolutely nothing to do with us are really, really rare. The vast majority of dogs, I think, and we've all seen it on holiday, you know, there's packs of dogs running free in the streets, masters of their own destiny, but living alongside and close to humans, and often being supported by the humans in some way, having it kept an eye on, being fed, but not actually being pets. There's plenty of feral cat populations. Cats live with us, but can also quite happily live without us, whereas the same is not true of dogs, which I think is just absolutely amazing, but also removes them from that myth that they're wolves, capable or able to survive on their own, and we should emulate that, because very, very few dogs do. And secondly, they can digest starches or carbohydrates much better than wolves. And again, that's because they've, you know, developed and grown alongside human settlements, where a large part of our nutrition is going to have come from carbohydrate sources. And so the dogs that did well and survived better alongside humans were the ones who could also digest that kind of food. That doesn't mean they're eating no meat, but that difference in their biology and their genetics and their digestive capacity again has changed from the wolf. So actually a better analogy for, if we're going to sort of continue on this sort of wild, like natural path, is free-ranging dogs. These dogs that live alongside humans but don't live with them. What do they survive on? How are they living? You know, they're living what is technically probably the most natural life for a dog. Well, they're scavengers. We all know how much of a scavenger our dogs are when you see what they eat. You know, they really do survive and are keen to, you know, eat first and ask questions later. But there's some really interesting studies looking at these free-ranging dogs and what their diets consist of. And there's a couple of really good ones that found that wild free-ranging dogs, what an enormous amount of their nutrition consists of is actual physical human waste. The stuff we poop out, dogs will eat. And that's available in, you know, rural communities and less developed places where there's maybe not quite such an established sewage system, and these dogs do great on it. You know, they're fit, they're lean, they've got great coat conditions, they're thriving on that kind of food. So if we were to really package up a natural diet for dogs, I'm not sure it would go down terribly well. Some pictures of that on the front of the bag. But, you know, it just goes to show that dogs can survive on anything, they do really well, but the fact that they are wolves is not true. And that appeal to nature fallacy sounds great on the surface, but when you dig a little bit deeper, it kind of loses a bit of that momentum. So some more thoughts on wolves. The average wild wolf is about 7. Free-roaming dogs live a little bit longer and a bit more variety, again because of that care they are given by humans. You know, we do look after them, we do feed them, that kind of thing. But you know, when it comes to nature, we want far more than that for our dogs, our pet dogs. We wouldn't be happy with that kind of lifespan. So again, you know, informed by, but not slavishly following nature. They feed kibble in zoos. I think this is a great fact. This dog is 16 years old and celebrating her birthday at the Smithsonian Zoo in America. And she would not have got to 16 without being in a zoo, but isn't she a fabulous old lady? But there she's having a birthday cake, something else I don't think nature serves up to you. And her birthday cake is full of kibble. Because a lot of zoos do use kibble to ensure that their animals are getting a nutritionally complete and balanced diet. Yes, they absolutely feed meat, and that is part of their diet as well. A large part of it is enrichment. Some nutrition comes from it. But again, you know, in terms of how do we feed these genuinely wild animals when they are being cared for by humans, a lot of zoos do use kibble-based foods for them. Wolves are genuine carnivores. You know, they really are. Whereas dogs, again, because of that adaptability, because of those changes, the debate actually rages about what our dogs are. Are they omnivorous, like humans, able to survive on a very wide variety of different foods? Are they facultative carnivores, which means that they're more carnivorous? They err to the side of carnivory, but that facultative nature means that they are able to, you know, take nutrients from all different kinds of foods. So the debate rages, but what they're not is wolves and what they're not is carnivores. And just one final point about wolves. Relative to their size, wolves have stronger jaws, thicker teeth, and more developed molars than our dogs. And this comes down to the fact that they are, you know, chasing prey across the wilds, having to hang on to it as it runs away, and they're getting kicked in the face probably. So their whole facial structure, relatively speaking, is more dense and more strong. And that pertains to whether we should feed our dogs bones or not. And again, often I see this, you know, wolves eat bones in the wild. They're chewing down on, you know, really big bones to look after themselves and to nourish themselves. So therefore, that's what we should give dogs. Now, there's a lot of different issues around that, particularly around dental health and fractures. And they happen in wolves still, even because of that. But again, just to point out that wolves are very, very different in a lot of different ways from our dogs. And we should not be equating dogs to wolves really at all. Myth number 2, you can judge a pet food by its ingredients list. No, you can't. And this is a really, really common one that I see an awful lot. But it's really important that an ingredients list tells you virtually nothing about the food apart from what's in it. how they are set out and regulate and worded is regulated by law, but that does not mean that they cannot be manipulated to appeal to, particularly to the human palate. Because, and why can't you judge an ingredients list? Well, it tells you absolutely nothing about the balance or the formulation of that diet. How suitable is it for the animal? What was the skill of the person that put it together? It tells you nothing about the digestibility of the diet, how much of that stuff that's in that food is actually digestible and available to our pets to be able to get into their systems, to get into their body and to nourish them. And we've got this manipulation problem. So here is a genuine ingredients list from a pet food. Obviously, I've stripped out all the branding. The colours are simply just so you can pick out the words a bit better. It's got fresh chicken for starters. We're going to come to meat being the first ingredient for seconds. But really, I wanted to look at all the lovely things that are in this diet. The blueberries and the apples and the strawberries and all the lovely sounding herbs and everything. And it sounds great. But are they actually useful for our pets? Are they doing anything for their nutrition? This ingredients list doesn't tell us. And it's a tiny amount. It's 0.04% blueberries. How is that actually contributing any nutrition to the diet? Is there a significant amount of antioxidants or of vitamins coming from these ingredients? Certainly the back of the bag, if you read it, tells you that they do. And what it means is that the front of the bag has some beautiful pictures of some strawberries and carrots and mangoes on it, which is great. But that's all appealing to our human nature. And of course, it's really normal to pick up a bag and turn it over and look at the ingredients list and try and decide whether it's something that you would like to feed to your animal. That's why they're written like this. That's why they have those things in them. Are they actually contributing to what's important, which is the nutrition of your pet and the nourishment of your pet? Who knows? That ingredients list doesn't tell you at all. So, and there is a common sort of saying amongst board-cert nutritionists that anything that's at the bottom, towards the sort of bottom half of an ingredients list is in there in such tiny amounts that effectively it can be deemed fairy dust. Now, when it comes to things like micronutrients, they are there in micro amounts, but are those ingredients contributing to those micronutrient amounts, or are they simply in there so the marketeers for the pet food can slap some lovely pictures on the front of the bag? The ingredients list doesn't give you that answer. This food might be amazing and brilliant and wonderful and fabulous quality, but this ingredients list does not tell you that, and it's really important to understand. The other thing that's in this ingredients list is the fructo oligosaccharides, and the other oligosaccharides, what they are is prebiotics. So yes, this food contains prebiotics, which probably is allowing the company to write on the front of the bag, contains prebiotics which aid healthy digestion or support digestion. Prebiotics do indeed do that, but are the prebiotics in this particular food doing that? They're there, but are they available? Are they in good enough quantities? Are they any use to our animals at all? It does not tell you that. And it's entirely possible that they haven't done any research into whether it supports digestion. They haven't done any trials to show that it's helpful. They've just whacked them in the bag so they can make some really good sounding claims on the front of the packaging. This food is 25% protein. We're going to come to things like that in a minute, but that's not necessarily maybe what you would assume if you read fresh chicken at 41% on the front on that ingredients list, and it is fortified with vitamins and minerals. So although they are claiming in this food that those, fruits and vegetables are contributing, they sort of say how wonderful they are in terms of the vitamins and health benefits that they have, which is absolutely true. Those things do and are having, they do give us vitamins and minerals, but they're not actually relying on those ingredients to give all the vitamins and minerals to that diet. They have fortified it as well. So are they contributing anything at all? Again, we just don't know. But we shouldn't be too side-eye about added micronutrients to pet foods. It's actually really difficult to create a complete and balanced diet without adding something like that in. And so that's a good thing. It's a good thing that they've put them in there. It's a good thing that they're there because it means they're paying attention to the micronutrient profile of the food and trying to make sure that what's in the bag is suitable for pets and is going to be healthy and to nourish them. However, that ingredients list, just like any ingredients list, does not tell you anything about that quality, digestibility, availability of that food. It is simply, there is a lot of manipulation that's happening with ingredients lists, and it's so important to realise that. And the only truly useful piece of information that's on a pet ingredients list is what it doesn't contain. So we've all got patients who maybe don't do so well on chicken or don't do so well on lamb. And so the most useful piece of information you can garner from an ingredients list is what it doesn't contain. Because something might say chicken on the front, but actually because of manufacturing laws and guidelines, sometimes those foods can also contain other meats like beef or lamb. So looking at the ingredients list for those cases and for those patients is actually really important. However, it comes with a caveat that there is possible cross-contamination. A lot of these diets are made in factories where you've got a chicken meal going down one production line and a lamb diet going down another production line, or maybe one did beef one day and then chicken is going down it the next. And unless you're doing a really detailed clean down of that production line, or in a factory where more than one are being created at once, you're definitely going to get aerosolization of micro aerosolization of proteins, and they're going to cross contaminate. And work has been done. There's some papers at the end of this talk showing you that. And you are going to get cross-contamination. And now for the vast majority of patients, of course, that's not going to matter because it's not tipping them over their reactivity threshold, but for some it is. And that's one of the reasons why, if we're going to conduct diet trials for animals that we do think are sensitive, it's really important to reach for those hydrolyzed diets, because they are the only ones where we can absolutely guarantee that they do not contain things that they say they don't contain. There is an enormous amount of cross-contamination happening with other diets. So, that's the only useful thing. And of course, there is an enormous amount of judging pet foods on ingredients lists. And one of the biggest places that happens is pet food rating websites. There's lots of them out there. I see them talked about on forums all the time. They look at, but the vast majority judge solely on ingredients lists. Or they're hugely weighted to reading the ingredients lists and giving an opinion on the quality of that diet. And it is so fundamentally flawed as a process. We really should not be listening to anyone who is doing that at all. And shamefully, I do see it every so often in pet food marketing and advertising. So if a pet food is advertising to me on Facebook, because they do quite a lot, because of course this is a subject that interests me, so my social media feeds are full of pet food adverts I often click on to go and check out the brands. If they tell me that their food is highly rated on a pet food rating website, that means one of two things. And I can understand why you would do it. I can understand if somebody says that your product is great and they are an independent, unbiased source. I can absolutely understand why you would want to shout about that. However, if you are a company with integrity, I don't think you would, because I think one of two things. Either you do know enough about nutrition to be creating and selling pet foods, in which case you should know enough about nutrition to know that you can't judge a pet food on its ingredients list. And while it's lovely that somebody says that your food is good, that is not a way for anyone to be able to tell if your food is good or not. So you are sort of slightly, in my opinion, manipulating and misleading your consumer. Or you genuinely think that you can judge a pet food by its ingredients list. That's why you're telling everybody it is a completely innocent mistake. However, you therefore do not have anywhere near the level of nutritional knowledge and expertise to be creating and selling pet food. So of course, for the vast majority of companies, it's the former. It's a marketing tool and they're using it to market. But I think because of this, you can't judge by an ingredients list. I don't think it's a very honest way of marketing, in my opinion. The only pet food ratings website or ratings place that I would recommend is the Pet Nutrition Alliance Pet Manufacturers Evaluation Report, which judges on the WSAVA guidelines, which we're coming to in a minute. Unfortunately, it's not as sexy or as judgy as pet food rating websites. It doesn't give things just a simplified mark out of 5. Nutrition, unfortunately, while it is fascinating, it is kind of complicated, and it's very difficult to boil things down to such a simple, number output. And it's kind of wordy and it's kind of American based, but if we're going to use one, it has to be that one. So how can you judge a pet food? I think that's the most important thing is how can we pick what's good for our own animals, what's good for our professional recommendations, what's good for our patients? How can we do it? Well, basically the overall and the most recommended, and the one that's definitely used by board cert veterinary nutritionists and people who really know what they're doing, is the WSAVA guidelines on selecting a pet food. So these guidelines have been put together by the WSAVA Global Nutrition Committee, which is an independent committee on which sits literally world-leading veterinary nutritionists and other people like that, and they've put these guidelines together as an objective way of judging pet foods and selecting pet foods and judging pet food companies. And these can be applied to all types of pet foods. These guidelines are available to all manufacturers and all types of pet foods. Some manufacturers choose to work hard to meet them, some do not. But it's important to say as well that the WSAVA do not approve pet foods. They simply put these guidelines out for manufacturers to follow if they wish or if they don't. So that's quite a complicated graphic. You can find that online quite easily, but this one is a slightly more simplified infographic. This isn't as available online, but you can screenshot that, or you can see who did it at the bottom and go there. But we're going to spend a little bit of time on this because I do think it's really important. And I think once you've got a fundamental understanding of this kind of thing, it actually becomes a lot easier to sort of work your way through pet foods and look at them far more objectively and be able to decide whether it's something that you are willing to feed or willing to recommend. So the first one is, do you employ a full-time qualified nutritionist? Now, you would think, wouldn't you, that a company whose job is creating nutrition for pet foods would probably employ a nutritionist? An enormous amount of them don't. Now, I do wonder who they do employ. I suspect they employ some people who do their marketing. However, it's okay. It depends, therefore, if they don't employ a full-time nutritionist, who is formulating their diets and how are they getting that person to formulate? Is that person permanently employed by the company? Are they contracting out to someone to help formulate their diets? That's not too bad, provided that nutritionist is well qualified. Or will they not tell you? Will they not tell you who's formulating their diets? And really, a company who is using a very well qualified nutritionist should A, be very happy to give you that information because it is absolutely fundamental to the product that they are producing and aiming to feed to our pets. But also B, they should be really proud of it. And when it comes to nutritionists, the top of the tree by quite some margin is the board certified veterinary nutritionist. So that's a veterinary surgeon who's gone through the veterinary training, who's gone through internship and residency and come out as a specialist in nutrition. And that not only means that they know all about ingredients, it means that they know how ingredients interact with each other, and most importantly, how ingredients interact with the body and with biology in both health and in disease. And I think that is, we really should be looking to our board cert vet nutritionists as the leaders in the field. However, there are also people who have PhDs in small animal nutrition and masters in small animal nutrition as well. And a master's degree, ideally backed up by a relevant first degree, should be the very minimum that we should expect from a company who genuinely is investing in the health of our animals, and they should be very happy to tell us that, and that information should be very readily available. So number two, who formulates the food? Because of course the nutritionist is important, but also there's lots of other people, food tech, food scientists, biologists. There's all sorts of other people that can have an input into the nutrition of our pets and therefore into their health. And again, a company should, employ some people who know how to formulate, create and monitor and manufacture pet foods. And they should be able to tell you who those people are. Ideally, of course, it would be a team of people. It's a team effort to create and be continually innovating in the pet food space to ensure that whatever you are marketing to pet foods really is, the best to our current knowledge and pushing that knowledge forward. Unqualified people consulting with professionals. So, they're getting that outside help in, but the people who are actually employed by the company aren't actually qualified in nutrition or food science in any way. I mean, obviously that's less ideal, but if they're reaching out for the right help, then that's better. Or they're not qualified, or they are unwilling to disclose. Well, I think if you're not willing to tell us how you're creating your pet food, then that's not something that I'm hugely willing to feed to my animals or recommend to my clients. How are your diets tested? Right, so this is quite a big one. How can we test pet foods? Because there's actually no requirement to test them at all or feed them to any animals before you sell it. But how is the testing? And according to the WSAVA, the pinnacle of testing is the AFCO feeding trial. Now, AFCO, we're going to come to a minute about who they are, but this is a feeding trial, again, that's been set up by a sort of an unbiased and independent body as the gold standard, if you like, to overuse a phrase, for testing a pet food. Now, that isn't actually hugely onerous, and I see a lot of criticism in some quarters about the AFCO feeding trials, because essentially what you have to do is you take 8 animals and you feed them for 6 months on a pet food. Only 6 of those animals have to finish the trial, and you have to do bloods and physical examinations. But as long as they essentially get to the other end of the trial without falling horribly ill or passing away, you can say that you've been through an AFCO feeding trial, which, obviously it's going to and it's going to cost some money. It's going to have to be some degree of investment for that company. But no, I agree, it doesn't particularly sound hugely onerous. However, I do think it's quite disingenuous, and I do see this criticism a lot from pet food companies and from nutritionists as well, pointing, going, well, an AFCO feeding trial, it's really not that intensive. And no, but therefore, why are you not doing it? Why aren't more companies at least doing that? And I think that's a question that really never gets answered. And also, there are some companies out there who are very rooted in science and evidence and research and pushing everything forward, who far out exceed the AFCO feeding trials. They are taking populations of animals and caring for them for their entire lives, feeding them, testing them, looking after them. There are lifetime studies. A lot of, unfortunately, the information is proprietary, but there are some companies who are absolutely flying above the AFCO feeding trials, and I personally think those are the ones that we really should be looking for as the pinnacle of nutrition. They're doing some food trials, or they're not testing their diets at all, or they're testing their diets via, you can test a diet via a computer program. You can put in all the ingredients into just a simple there's online programs to do it, and it'll spit out whether it's balanced or not, and if it's not balanced, what supplements you have to add to it. I mean, some degree of checking is important, and I'm glad companies are doing that, but there is a definite variety in how brands are testing their foods, and it's a question that I would certainly want to know the answer to. I'm having to lean in because these words are quite small on my screen. Where are your foods produced and manufactured? So this is an interesting one. So some companies do own their own factories, and therefore they are in total control of absolutely everything, from the ingredients coming in, quality control, to the manufacturing process, to the packaging, to the whole thing. But that's obviously a massive expense. It's hugely expensive to run a factory, and I do understand that. And so I don't think it's, we shouldn't be absolutely calling this a complete red line, like the qualifications of the nutritionists, I think, really are. There's a lot of companies that use third-party manufacturers, which I didn't know about at all until I started learning about this. So there's a few big factories in the UK and obviously worldwide who manufacture pet foods for all kinds of people. And essentially what you can do as a company is you can go to them and say, we would really like to create a dog food that's based with chicken and salmon, and it contains mangoes and blueberries. And they will, often these third-party manufacturers employ really good, well-qualified nutritionists, PhD standard, that kind of thing. They will take the ingredients, they will create a complete and balanced diet, and they will make it. And the company who's requested them to make it, their input is often the initial idea and then the packaging at the end. And then the middle bit, the creating of the nutrition, is done by a third party. But actually, a lot of those third parties are incredibly good at it. So I think that's okay. And again, if they're unwilling to disclose that information, that it shouldn't be private. Maybe not exactly who is making your food. I can maybe understand that, but certainly, a little bit more detail would be great. What quality control measures do you use? Are you batch testing? Are you able to discuss, or are you not willing to discuss that? I think, quality control, particularly on those ingredients, is absolutely vital. Not always perfect, but, companies really should be taking it seriously. Can you provide a complete nutritional analysis? It's great to know what the protein percentage is and the fat percentage is, those macronutrients, but those micronutrients are absolutely vital as well. And companies should be able to provide that, even if all they're doing is running it through computer programs. The computer programs are designed to, list all the macro and micronutrients according to, and we're coming to these guys soon, FEDIAF and AFCO guidelines. There's about 40 different nutrients that need to be in pet foods, in dog foods and cat foods, and they have maximums and minimums. And a pet food company should be paying attention to all of them, and at the very least be able to tell us about them. What calorie content have you got? It is not currently a requirement to put the calorie information onto pet food, and I think that change might be coming. As anyone who has run a weight loss clinic will know, to try and figure out what the calorie density of a pet food that an animal might be on, if we're trying to calculate their daily requirements, can be a bit time consuming, because a lot of the time you have to ring the company up. But if you ring them up, they should be able to provide it. Again, it's about that depth of knowledge they have about this product that they are producing. And what kind of product research are you doing? Now, actually, I think this is really vital. Now, I appreciate that some companies are smaller, and putting funding into research and development is not always possible, especially if they're just starting out. But there are some companies with very large consumer bases and very large turnovers, and from looking on the outside at the amount of Facebook advertising I get, very large marketing budgets, who don't seem, it would appear, to be doing very much research and development. And I think if you are committed as a company to nourishing our animals and to caring for their health in one of the most fundamentally important ways, you should also be committed to the research in your field, and you should be working to push our knowledge forward, to constantly do better, to be able to better care for our animals. And there are some companies who are absolutely, that's what they're rooted in. They're doing an enormous amount of research. They're really pushing our knowledge forward, and then they're publishing that research into the public domain. So everybody, including other companies who are not doing that, can take that knowledge and create diets that are complete and balanced and healthy for our animals. So while I understand that not every company can afford to do it, I think every company should be willing to do it in some shape or form. And I do not see that in an enormous amount of pet food companies. And I think as a science-based profession, we understand the value of science and research, and therefore we should be supportive of it in this nutrition space. The Pet Nutrition Alliance, obviously we've just talked about that. Are they a UK pet food member? So this is an interesting one. So UK pet food, obviously it's only pertaining to the UK for this particular one, but other countries do have similar bodies. Are the manufacturers industry body for the pet food space? They're a bit like the BVA for pet food. Membership is voluntary, but in my opinion, membership of UK pet food indicates again that commitment to their industry, to that communication, and to our pets. And there are some quite large companies, again the ones that I see on Facebook, who aren't members. And I think membership is important, for that commitment, but also in other ways. First of all, UK pet food members agree to adhere to good manufacturing and nutritional guidelines. Those things are all set up, in FEDIAF, coming to them. However, this is a public commitment, a sign on a dotted line that we will follow these nutritional guidelines, which I think is very important. But they also agree, and for me personally, this is a really big one, they also agree to good marketing guidelines. There is an enormous amount of misleading, scaremongering, fear-based marketing in the pet food world, and you see these adverts all the time that talk badly about competitors or make pretty outrageous claims about what may or may not be in other pet foods. And I think it serves no purpose other than undermining trust from pet owners in the pet food space. And UK pet food members are not allowed to do that and agree to not do that. And I think we should be rewarding and supporting brands with truth and integrity, particularly in their marketing, because it is a bit of a wild west out there. And that's why when it comes to a pet food, being a member of UK Pet Food in the UK is something that I think is, really important to me personally. And just as a small aside, this is one of the only times in this talk I'm going to talk about raw food. So raw food manufacturers can also be members of UK Pet Food. And in the UK, the numbers vary, but the last count, I think there was about 80 or 90 producers of raw food, DEFRA registered in England, in the UK, but only about maybe 15 of those companies are UK pet food members. And again, so I think when we're supporting our clients to feed formulations like that, we can really, sort of drill down on the companies that have some integrity by looking at that list first. And UK Pet Food also has an independent raw accreditation scheme, which again, not all of those 15 members have joined, but it's another layer of sort of reliability and objective measurement of that company. What the raw accreditation scheme is it's taking those DEFRA guidelines for manufacturing raw food, and it's an independent assessment to ensure that company is genuinely following them, particularly important with respect to things like bacterial safety, which is obviously something which really is important to us as the health professionals in the space. So again, if you've got a pet owner who is raw feeding, those are the two things that I would be looking for in addition to all of these others: membership of UK Pet Food, and have they been through the raw accreditation scheme. Again, those things are an additional cost to a company, but I think if they are going to take on the privilege of feeding and nourishing our pets, then they should be making some investments into themselves and into their industry and into our animals. What does the website say? Again, I go on a lot of these websites because this is something that really interests me. Oh, you look like a new pet food manufacturer in the space. Let's beetle off and have a look. Or if a client comes to you and says, I'm feeding this food, is it any good? And you've never heard of it. I mean, obviously you're going to go to their website. And these questions should be answered on the website really easily and really easy to find. And the amount that don't even talk about who formulates their diet, doesn't even mention the qualification of the nutritionists creating the nutrition that they are selling, is astonishing. They talk about how their blueberries were made on the sunlit hills of Spain, or the lambs were gambolling on New Zealand fields, but they don't talk about their formulation or their quality control, or who they employ to actually create their diets. And I think if a brand can't tell me quickly, simply and succinctly answer those important questions, even if maybe in the background they are doing things well, then again, it just inherently makes me unwilling to feed them or to recommend them, because I think that they should really be, I get that it's not that sexy. It's not as sexy as a sunlit blueberry to tell me, your quality control measures, but it is, arguably far more important, and it should be relatively easy to find on pet food manufacturing websites, even though websites obviously are essentially marketing tools. That information should be there, and it hardly ever is. Does the pet like it, and are they doing well on it? I think it is absolutely fair to, a pet, to look at a pet and think, well, they're enjoying their diets, they seem healthy and well and energized and healthy, shiny coats. Now, that does not guarantee nutritional, completeness and health, but I think it's totally, we don't have to change everything if they're not on a diet that we, if they're on a diet that we may not entirely approve of, as long as we can help the client with that decision-making process. I think it's completely reasonable for them to, feed whatever they like. We can't change them. We can't change everybody's minds, and we shouldn't be aiming to, but we should be supporting them and helping them to learn and educate. Right, so that was a bit of a long one. So a bit more about pet food packaging, because of course that's what's in front of us. What information can we use on the pet food packaging to help us make some decisions about pet foods? Because that is literally what we're doing in pet shops. That's what I do in pet shops, is look at the packaging and think, what's this trying to tell me? An enormous amount of the pet food bag is marketing, huge amount, virtually all of it. But are there things that is useful? So, is it complete or complementary? Obviously, we need to know that. What species is it for? Cats or dogs? There are some that do both species, and I would be inherently suspicious of those. What life stage is it for? Is it for puppies and kittens, that vital growth stage? Is it for adults? Is it for seniors? If you are feeding, or if a client is feeding an all life stage diet, what they are essentially feeding is a puppy or kitten food. And I think that's something which is really important to understand. The most important life stage is growth. That is the one that we have to get right. They got one chance to grow. That's the one that is most nutritionally specific. Adults and seniors, different. So if we're feeding an all life stages diet, that diet is formulated for growth and development, and everybody else just follows along. And there may well be some changes in the feeding guidelines to reflect that once the growth is finished, that nutritional density might not be required by an adult dog, and certainly not by a senior dog. But often our clients are hugely following feeding guidelines. So, and I personally think that there is enough nutritional knowledge and expertise and refinement within the pet food space that all life stage diets really shouldn't, I don't think, even be a thing, because we know what our pets need at various different life stages. And that's the great thing about pet food, isn't it? There is such a lot of choice. That's also the really difficult thing about pet food. There's loads of choice. How do we choose? But I think those very specific diets are there is some science and research behind them, and I think that's what I would be advising my clients to feed. There's set standards for growth. There's various standards for adults. Interestingly, there's no set standard for senior animals in terms of nutritional profiles, because it's so different when they get older. All of them are slightly different, so it's a little bit more complicated there. Feeding guide to a degree, obviously. We've all met animals feeding absolutely bang on what the feeding guide says, and they're still, struggling with their weight. But the feeding guide is important. And a little point there, if we are aiming for an animal to lose weight, then yes, we can feed them to the lower end of the feeding guide. But it's really important, if we're doing that in addition, we're not accidentally, in addition to making them calorie deficient, also making them nutritionally deficient. And that's one of the reasons why, if we are dealing with our pets who are struggling with obesity, we should be moving those animals to light diets or weight loss diets, which take into account that reduced calorie intake while not compromising or limiting their nutritional intake. The nutritional analysis. Now, this is the important piece of information. That boring, tiny, minuscule little writing underneath the beautiful sounding ingredients list that tells us the protein, the fat, the micronutrient levels, but you do need a certain degree of education and knowledge to be able to read that, to be able to decide whether the food is good or not. And here I'm going to recommend two people for you. Now, they are both on YouTube. I appreciate that this isn't evidence-based medicine necessarily. However, both of these creators, one is called Dr. Ray. She's Animal Doc Ray. These are linked in the back of the talk. Animal Doc Ray, she's a vet in a small animal vet like me in America. And another guy is called the Pet Food Puzzle Guy, who used to work for Hills for 30 years. So yes, you can argue that he has some bias, but I would listen to him before you decide. Because obviously he's worked alongside, leading veterinary nutritionists for that whole period of time. And both of those channels are absolutely fantastic at judging pet foods and looking at that nutritional analysis and telling you what they think and how they are analysing the food from that. So if this is something that you are interested in, I would definitely go and check those guys out, because I've learned an enormous amount from both channels and it's really interesting. Clinically proven. So if something says clinically proven on the bag, that means that it's had to go through 2 clinical trials to make that claim. So that's why you don't see clinically proven very often. That's why you see may help or supports or aids, because those are not legally mandated terms at all. So you can put those prebiotics in the bag. You can say this aids in healthy digestion, but you don't actually have to do any sort of work at all to prove that that is even remotely true. But if you see clinically proven, you know that it is. Now, vet recommended is interesting. So in America, again, according to AFCO guidelines, I promise we're coming to them. In America, if you put vet recommended on a pet food bag, you have to have asked a representative sample of veterinarians, and the majority of those have had to recommend your food. In the Europe and in the UK, it is different. I think you just need to get a vet to say the food is good, and then you can say this is vet recommended. And because of the RCVS guidelines, that vet can potentially, if they want to, legitimately remain anonymous, or they can stand up and say, I'm a vet and I think this food is great. And while I have every respect for my colleagues and I do respect their opinions, that vet doesn't necessarily need to have any nutritional expertise or knowledge. They can just, if they're happy for their face and their professionalism to be used on the marketing, then you can just say vet recommended. So while it's lovely to see that, and I'm pleased that somebody in this profession thinks this product is good, it doesn't have the same weight of meaning as it does in America. The AFCO statement. So this is more of an American thing. You do not see it on pet food packaging very much in the UK or Europe at all. So for the American watchers, you probably see this fairly frequently. And it says formulated to formulate, we've done animal feeding tests according to AFCO before we've sold this food. So that food has been through an AFCO feeding trial, which I actually think is something we should definitely be welcoming and recommending. Or this food is formulated to meet the nutritional levels established by AFCO, so they have followed the AFCO guidelines in creating this diet. And both of those things are something which we really should be in sort of almost basic requirements, really, for if someone's going to manufacture and produce a pet food to nourish animals. The FEDIAF labelling guidelines. Now, if you want to read the document which FEDIAF have produced, you go right ahead and read it. I have tried, but it's very dense. But essentially, it's things like the terminology of complete and balanced means something legally, and it means that they are following FEDIAF labelling guidelines, but it's not sort of written in black and white on the packaging like the AFCO ones are. But definitely do look out for them if you are in America. Right, and bonus information, words that mean nothing on pet food. So this talk has all come out of my own little brain. So you are basically sitting through some of the things that I am the most passionate about. And this is something that I am hugely passionate about. Misleading marketing in pet food and what things do and what things don't mean. And you see this all the time. So the word holistic simply means whole. Of course, it's been kind of shifted over to mean, alternative, different, natural, but there's no legal definition of holistic. Hypoallergenic, the reason that means nothing is because what's hypoallergenic, so what's less likely to trigger an allergic reaction in one animal, is not going to be the same in another. So you can't produce a food and say this is hypoallergenic because it's based on the individual. Hydrolyzed, that absolutely does mean something. Hypoallergenic, no. Premium, there's nothing in there. Human grade we'll come back to in a minute. Nasties and fillers, these are my hated terms. Absolutely despise these in advertising. And if you see a company or nutritionist using them, you can pretty much discount anything else they say because they are such disingenuous terms. There's no nasties in pet food. What on earth does that even mean? It's just chemophobia. It's people, creating fear around ingredients that, people don't understand. I don't understand this, therefore I'm afraid of it. but that's not how these things work. So we shouldn't, there's no such thing as a nasty, whatever a nasty is. And fillers, there's no such thing as fillers in pet food either. Every ingredient contributes to that ingredients panel, to the nutrition of that diet. So there's no such thing as a filler. And again, it's just a meaningless and much misused fear-mongering phrase. And also, I would argue that the term nutritionist means nothing because of this, lack of protected term for pet nutritionist. I think we'll tackle veterinary nurse, and I'd like to see that protected before we turn our attention to pet nutritionist. But essentially, nutritionist means nothing, particularly if that company is not willing to share the nutritionist qualification. So, if you say nutritionist formulated or nutritionist recommended, unless that you can dive a bit deeper into that statement and find out exactly who this nutritionist is and what their qualifications are, I would discount that. Human grade is an interesting one, and I see this used an enormous amount. But the thing is that all ingredients in pet food are human grade, particularly when it comes to meat. So all meat in the EU, and more recently, the rules have changed slightly more recently in America, but it's pretty much true over there now. All meat that goes into pet food is suitable for human consumption. It has been passed as human grade or suitable for human consumption. So therefore, this is a meaningless phrase. And the reason I don't like it is because pet food brands will put, our pet food is human grade, which is great. It's a basic legal requirement that it should be human grade. So it's not massively much of a flex, really, when you know about these things. However, in the terms of the marketing, it sounds amazing. But it also indicates that other pet foods might not be human grade. And that's what I don't like. It's indicating that, they're better because they're human grade. They're all human grade. I get how it sounds great. Ultimately, it's meaningless and actually just a basic legal requirement. I mean, I should hope so that it's human grade. It's really important that it's human grade. So it's not a flex. Human grade is not a flex. Words that do mean something in pet food advertising: natural, organic, and non-GMO. And you won't see these nearly as much on packaging as holistic and premium, because you actually have to do some work to get these on your packaging. So, look out for this when you see advertising. Right, who are AFCO and FEDIAF, these people that I've been banging on about? So AFCO is the American Association of Feed Controls Officials, and FEDIAF is the European Pet Food Industry Federation. They are basically the governing, overseeing bodies of pet foods in their respective land masses. And they set the standards and they set the rules for pet foods, and they particularly set the nutritional standards. And those nutritional standards, like I said earlier, more than 40 different nutrients are listed in the FEDIAF and AFCO feeding guidelines. Those standards have been based on decades and decades and thousands and millions of hours of research. And certainly for FEDIAF, I don't know about AFCO, but definitely for FEDIAF, there is an advisory panel that meets every single year, that reviews all the literature, that reviews all the science, that reviews all those guidelines, and they update them on an annual basis. So this is a dynamic, changing process based on the research we have, which is why it's so important that research is being done into pet food. So we know that we are always bettering what we are offering to our animals and improving their nutrition and therefore their quality of life. And these are the guys who are doing that. And they don't endorse or approve foods either, just like the WSAVA. These guys set the guidelines for other people to follow. If they choose to follow them or not, that's entirely their prerogative. But if they say they're following them, they must be following them. And it's one of the main reasons why pet food across the board these days is so healthy and so nourishing for our animals, regardless of the brand and regardless of the price. Because another pet hate I have in the pet food space, I do have a few, is the shaming that happens around pet foods towards pet owners, particularly if they are feeding a more budget option. You see it very much, and I absolutely hate it. Everybody is doing the very best for their animals within their means, but because of these overseeing guidelines and these nutritional guidelines and these legal requirements that manufacturers have to follow, the vast majority of commercial pet foods are complete and balanced and safe for our animals, regardless of how much money you are spending on them. Yes, there's differences in price points and refinement and research and other extra ingredients that might be in those foods, but at a basic level, all foods are great. And, pet food shaming is just something that I just actively despise. And certainly as vet professionals, I don't, obviously we're not doing that. We're here to support our pet owners, but I see it a lot, and I absolutely hate the way that it must make people feel. I cannot bear it. And this is the reason why, not only is it really unfair and unkind, it's also untrue. Right, okay. we're on to myth number 3. I appreciate that I've gone, over ingredients in quite a lot of detail, but I do think it's really important, and I hope you agree. So meat should always be the first ingredient. This is how you tell if a food is great. You turn it over, you look at that ingredients list, which obviously we're all going to do, and if it lists meat as the first ingredient for my carnivorous dog or my carnivorous cat, cats actually are carnivores, that must mean the diet is great. No, it doesn't. Ingredients lists are listed in weight order. Fresh meat is 70% water, so it's very heavy in comparison to other ingredients. But of course, that water disappears with cooking. So it's not the order of the ingredients list that is important, it's the nutritional analysis, like I said previously. So here are 2, again, genuine ingredients lists, but with all the branding stripped out. The colours are just so you can read them properly. The first one, free-range lamb and fresh ostrich. Amazing. Love that. So natural. There's packs of pugs galloping across the African plains to bring down the ostrich. We're not feeding our dogs as nature intended. We're not breeding our dogs or producing dogs as nature intended at all. And that's absolutely fine. If you want to put fresh ostrich in your pet food, then go for it. It's a great, lean, healthy protein. But that diet contains over 60% protein sources in the ingredients list. The rest of the ingredients list also sounds amazing, doesn't it? Dried apple pulp, pumpkin, salmon oil, glucosamine and chondroitin. So maybe with the oil and the glucosamine and chondroitin, this diet is making some claims about joint health. I have no idea. But maybe they are. But are they able to, does it say clinically proven or does it say supports? But given that it's actually in the diet, because it's in the ingredients list, they can make that claim quite legitimately, but is it doing any good? And then there's the prebiotics in that one as well. Anyway, so basically, it sounds great, but is 0.03% turmeric doing any heavy lifting in terms of the nutrition? Maybe it is. I would consider it fairly unlikely at that tiny percentage. However, it means they can put it on the right. But that's really not what we're talking about now. We're really concentrating on just those first ingredients, because this one sounds amazing. There's 2 meat sources at the beginning. Fantastic. The second one, the first ingredient is corn. Oh, corn. We must never feed our animals corn. Are they beasts of the field? Are they chickens pecking at corn? We're coming to grains later in the talk. And then the second one is poultry meal. So meal is just dehydrated protein sources. So it's just packed with protein, 35% chicken. But you can see that this one on the right of my screen anyway, it just isn't as pretty sounding. It isn't as, it's not made to appeal, is it at all? Animal fats, beet pork. In fact, it sounds pretty awful. However, now I've learnt more about this, I feel that I am being manipulated by the recipe, by the ingredients list on the left. And I feel that the one on the right isn't playing the game. They're not trying, because they understand that their ingredients list isn't important. And they're quite, they must be quite confident in their diet if they're not doing that. So I now sort of inherently prefer the one that isn't trying to make me feel something with the ingredients list. But the point we're making in this slide is look at the typical analysis of the protein particularly. The protein levels in these diets are exactly the same. And that is because those 2 meat sources at the beginning of that ingredients list are 70% water. So when they are cooked and into the food, the protein percentage is the same as the one that just has the protein meal, and it's actually the second ingredient. But because it's very proteinaceous, it's very protein dense, the protein comes out at exactly the same level. Is there any difference in the digestibility of those proteins? Well, without, if we can find some digestibility data from these companies, then we could tell, but it doesn't tell you that from the ingredients list. And there is no inherently more digestibility in fresh than there is in dried protein sources. They are slightly different, but, one is not inherently better than the other. But this is really just to show that protein percent, and that's a good protein percentage. That's well within AFCO and FEDIAF guidelines. It's not super low, it's not super high. You don't really want high protein levels. It's kind of pointless and expensive and a little bit wasteful. But that's meat. Meat doesn't need to be the first ingredient in order to judge a pet food, ever. Number 4, byproducts are bad. Okay, so we're cracking on now. You see this all the time, and I think byproducts is a rubbish name, and the pet food industry does have a bit of a PR problem when it comes to some of the terminology that is used, because I think byproducts, I see people saying, oh, it's just the scrapings off the factory floor. They just scoop up all the scraps that have been sat and everyone's trodden on and put it in a bin marked pet food and wheel it off to the factory. And actually, I think it pretty much does sound like that, doesn't it? Byproducts. But actually, a lot of the terminology in the pet food space was decided like back in the sort of 1950s and 60s when pet food manufacturing was getting going. And they were just using terminology that was described what actually was happening. So byproducts are basically parts of animals that are byproducts of the human meat manufacturing process. You know, they are the bits of the animals that humans do not want to eat, but are still, like I said, passed as fit for human consumption and very nutritious and very valuable. And they are also defined by law. So in the meat, we've got beef, lamb, pork, and goat. It includes, you know, the internal organs, the intestines, which, yes, to the human palate is like, ooh, you know, anyone's granny tried to get them to eat liver when they were young. You can imagine that, you know, for the amount of animals that are slaughtered, there's simply not the market for their livers. But though they are nutritious and they are good, and if they can't go to the human market or the human market doesn't want them, then let's send them to the pet food market. But also it's important to know what it doesn't contain. So it doesn't contain hair, horns, teeth, or hooves. There's no toenails in your pet's food. Again, a claim I see. Poultry, it's different because, you know, different species, but the important thing in there is it doesn't contain feathers, which is also something that I see claimed. There is one pet food that does contain feathers, a hydrolyzed diet. Feathers actually are quite proteinaceous, but I think from what I understand, in order for them to get feathers into that diet, they had to jump through quite a few regulatory hoops. You know, these rules are very strict. So byproducts are not something to be feared at all. They're the bits of the carcass that aren't sent to the human markets. They are suitable for human consumption. They are not 4D meat. Again, a claim I will often see in the online space. So 4D stands for dead, dying, diseased, or disabled. And those are, so down animals in the field and that kind of thing. Those would not be passed for human as fit for human consumption. So they are not in the pet food space for pet food consumption either. And I think that's what's really important to understand. And again, if anybody or any brands or any nutrition courses, because I've seen this taught, I've seen this in the curriculum for nutrition courses, are mentioning and teaching that, you know, 4D meat is in pet food, then that isn't correct. Europe is slightly different to America, but America have recently sort of more or less come in line with Europe. Or roadkill. I mean, obviously there's no roadkill in pet food. Pet food manufacturers, regardless of the kind of food that they're making, really do need quite a reliable source of basic ingredients. And I don't think they're waiting just for deer to be occasionally run over and arrive at the factory for them to, you know, make a bag of pet food. So obviously it doesn't contain roadkill. Those byproducts are often more nutrient rich. Like I said, your granny was right. There is an enormous amount of micronutrients in those bits of the animals that we're really not interested in eating, so we can use them to nourish our pets instead. And they're generally more economical, you know, so the muscle meat, a beef steak, is obviously definitely going to be more expensive than the offal. So manufacturers are able to make complete and balanced and healthy, nourishing pet foods for an economical price and make great nutrition available and affordable to all pet owners. And that's really, really important. And of course, it's environmentally sustainable, because where else is it going to go? It's just going to go to waste otherwise. And that sustainability is very important. And then this economical. So what this slide is all about is this fixed formula versus variable formula that you will see on pet foods. So you can use that broad terminology of meat, or not chicken, which allows the company to vary the formulation. So it allows them to legally vary the ingredients that are going into the diet, but what it does not mean is they're not varying the formulation, the balance, the nutritional analysis of that diet. And it's sometimes used to pass savings on to the consumer, because if the price of meat varies at market, you know, depending on the year, of course it does, time of year, of course it does. And so if they can go out and be more variable in what they're purchasing initially, then they can, you know, pass those savings on to the consumer. And that's where you get this fixed versus variable formula. So the first ingredients list there is a fixed formula, 75% turkey. If you want to create a turkey diet and put turkey in it, that's absolutely great. You go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. But then the other one is, again, a much less pretty sounding ingredients list. It contains meat and animal derivatives. We're coming to that term in a minute. That's more of that's the sort of European version of byproducts. But meat and animal derivatives simply means that they can vary that formulation. So they don't have to stick to turkey, or they don't have to stick to lamb, or they don't have to stick to ostrich. They can vary what's going into the diet. But for most pets with robust systems that aren't particularly oversensitive, that's absolutely fine. It's really not a problem. But the nutritional analysis, which is what is actually important, not the ingredients list, does not vary. And we should not be afraid of ingredients lists that don't contain, that aren't being specific. If that's important to you, or if that's important to a client, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with feeding a fixed formula diet if that's what you wish for. But it's not true to say that fixed formula diets are somehow inherently superior or better than variable formula diets. And again, that is something I see a lot with this pet food shaming that unfortunately is so prevalent. And it just isn't true. So what about meat and animal derivatives? Well, it's basically an interchangeable term with byproducts, essentially, but it's more of a European terminology. So we'll see it more on pet food packaging over here than we might see the term byproducts. And there's the definition in law. It's slightly broader than byproducts, and actually also includes muscle meat. So you might say it's a little bit higher quality, but of course you can't, because they're all very good quality. But here is a ingredients list that includes meat and animal derivatives in it. And it says 4% chicken, and like the one previously said 4% beef. And again, this is a legally mandated thing. The company has to write at least 4% of whatever so that meat and animal derivatives has to contain at least 4% of some named meat source. What it does not mean is it contains only 4% chicken or only 4% beef. There could be 10% lamb, 3% ostrich, 5% pork. There may well be, like we're saying, this mixed variable formula of meat, but there has to be one named meat of at least 4% or some percentage. But what it does not mean is it contains only 4% of that meat. And I see this in pet food advertising. I've seen it with pet food adverts saying other pet foods only contain 4% meat, and it just isn't true. And it's that disingenuous, misleading, scaremongering marketing that I so completely despise, and it just reflects so badly on the companies that are doing it. Now, this may contain some of the protein sources in this diet, like a lot of diets, may well come from plant sources as well. We can get protein from various places, and we're going to come to that in a minute. But actually, what's important when it comes to protein is the digestibility. How much of that protein that's in the diet is actually making its way into the animal and is available to you. But also, what's the amino acid profile of that protein? And those amino acids can be derived from both meat and plant sources. So some of the protein, the overall total protein percentage in this diet may, like a lot of diets, some of it may be coming from meat sources and some of it may be coming from plant sources, but plant protein is not something to be particularly concerned about if that company has done the work to make sure that the amino acid profile of the diet is correct. And if you go to the FEDIAF guidelines when it comes to their nutritional guidelines, the amino acids that should be in pet foods are listed there. So the information is out there for pet foods. But what it does not contain, and it's another particular pet hate of mine, and easy to misconstrue for an innocent pet owner reading a label, absolutely, completely unacceptable to misconstrue from a company producing pet food who 100% definitely knows better. It does not only contain 4% meat. So a little bit more about meat. Just again to point out that a lot of these terminologies do have some sort of legal definition. So flavour doesn't need to contain any of that ingredient. We don't really generally see that hugely in sort of day-to-day pet foods. That's more for treats. It's one of the reasons why a beef pot noodle can be vegan. Flavoured with less than 4%, with rich in 4% menu, 26%. And meat, of course, is dehydrated protein products. It's protein powder. The guys at the gym who want to really work on their muscles. I have very little gym knowledge, but that seems to be what they eat, what these people who really know about nutrition. So again, we really shouldn't be afraid of protein meal or meat meal. It is just a purified protein source, highly digestible and very good quality. Depending on the company a little bit, but still. Point still stands. Number 5, these ingredients are fillers. I told you we were coming back to this because this is one of my most despised things in marketing, the use of the word filler, because it means absolutely nothing. And often they will, I've seen nutritionists, unfortunately ones who have not been given the level of education that they believe that they have, which I think is a shame for them, accusing things of fillers. And as soon as you accuse ingredients like this of fillers, it does sadly, really highlight the gaps in nutritional knowledge. So obviously grains, we're coming to those in a minute. Cellulose, I see this a lot. Cellulose is wood pulp. Cellulose is insoluble fibre. So it's helping with satiety, fecal consistency, encouraging gut motility. It's going through the intestines. It is keeping things moving. It is helpful in giving that feeling of fullness. Beet pulp is another quite common fermentable fibre source, and that is vital for a healthy microbiome. And there's an enormous amount of talk about the microbiome at the moment. If you follow human nutritionists or interested in human nutrition, you must have heard of it, and there's a growing body of research done by a lot of private investment into pet food. But isn't that amazing? Because we are learning so much about the microbiome, and there are companies funding that research to aid in our knowledge and our health of our pets. Not all of them, which is a big shame, but some of them definitely are. And so, and the health of the microbiome is just going to be this explosion of knowledge, I think, in the next sort of 10 years or so. But really what you need to nourish a microbiome is good quality fibre, and lots of fermentable fibre or indigestible fibre. And that fibre isn't for us, it's for our microbiome. And one of the reasons why your doctors, if they're talking to you, will encourage you to eat a lot of like green leafy veg and that kind of thing. Obviously it's for the micronutrients, but a lot of it is because of the fibre. There's loads of fibre, healthy fibres in that kind of food, and they're nourishing the microbiome. So I think it's arguable to say that the pet food industry have actually been ahead of the human nutrition industry, or better than the human nutrition industry, in getting that fibre into our pets to aid their microbiome health, because of course we can control what they eat. Sadly, I can control what I eat as well, but that doesn't necessarily always be a good thing. But for my pets, I know that I can nourish them amazingly. And so the fibre thing is hugely misunderstood by people who don't really understand how to, what ingredients actually in, why they're there, and what purpose they serve. But, let's not be afraid of fibre. Let's welcome fibre. It's fantastic. And I think we're going to learn loads more about it in the next few years. Brewer's rice, love this. Until I started working on this, I hadn't actually ever realised. So, when you eat rice at home and there's all the little grains in the packet, all the grains are the same size. They're all equal. They're unbroken. Whereas brewer's rice is broken rice. So it's just the bits of grain that have managed to get smashed. Which humans don't want, because we want, consistency and beautiful food. So it used to go to the brewing industry. And this is another ingredient that was named back in the 60s, just a practical name. This was rice that didn't go to the human market, it went to the brewing market to brew beer. And now a lot of it is also used in the pet food industry, because that rice goes into the food. Nobody cares if it's broken or not. It doesn't change its nutrition at all. But I think, again, it's just, if someone could come up with some better PR terms for the new pet food industry, that would just be absolutely amazing, because I think there is a huge PR problem, because it really does sound, I think, like they've brewed a load of beer. For some reason there's a load of rice scum on the bottom. I don't know how they make beer. I don't drink it, and that's just then shunted off in a dirty old truck to the pet food manufacturers. It's just not true. It's just called brewer's rice because the brewers used to use it. Maybe they're sad that it's going to pet food. I don't know. And corn gluten meal is another example. So it's a source of protein. There's no gluten in corn gluten meal at all. But again, back in the day, the terms protein and gluten were more or less interchangeable, and it's only more recently that they've come to mean very different things. So I think this is now being changed to corn protein meal, because these corn sources can actually be great sources of protein for animals, containing all those essential amino acids and essential fatty acids and that kind of thing. But again, I think, from a human perspective, we're sort of trained, aren't we, or predisposed to look at the word gluten and think, oh, bad, makes me bloat, terrible, whereas it doesn't actually contain any gluten. So they're changing the name to make it easier and less confusing. And talking of grains are bad. Obviously, our animals are not beasts of the field. They're not chickens. They shouldn't be eating grains. But grains are a really great thing to have in our pet food. So first of all, they're not commonly associated with allergies at all. I think we see the finger pointed at them very, very frequently for our allergic or atopic pets. The most common allergens are the protein sources. You can see wheat does come in there, but it's quite low down, and corn and rice are absolutely tiny. Genuine gluten allergies are very rare. Those gluten intolerances, there was in the red setters. I think that's more or less been bred out now. Border terriers have epileptoid cramping syndrome, which is often gluten responsive. So if you've got a patient like that, then calling up a food company and discussing with them which diets are gluten free and which are genuinely gluten free, because those probably are some of the patients where we need to be very careful about this factory cross contamination. So we need to be talking to the pet foods who really, really are knowledgeable about how their food is manufactured, are doing that past testing and quality control, so we can really pick those diets that are going to help our patients. Isn't it amazing that we have the ability now within veterinary medicine to fix problems with food? Food nourishes and heals, and it's phenomenal. Grains are also highly digestible. So a point about digestibility, you will see that sometimes in pet foods claiming, you know, the highly digestible diet. We should be able to put a figure on that because digestibility studies are not that difficult. You measure what goes into the front end of the animal and you measure what comes out the back end of the animal and you look at the difference. And so, you know, an 80% digestibility is pretty much a basic, again, pretty basic. And, you know, most foods are very highly digestible. So the nutrition that's in that diet, about 80% of it should be heading into your animal. So 80 to 90% plus digestibility on the grains. What's in those grains, that nutrition that's getting into our grains is getting into our animals. And, you know, sometimes I see pet foods, they're not so much recently, interestingly, claiming like 75% or 80% digestibility in their diets, which again sounds great until you know a bit more about it. And then you're like, actually, that's pretty basic. You know, so unfortunately, it's so easy to mislead through marketing. But of course, that's when they're cooked. We are not feeding our animals, just like we're not feeding ourselves, an ear of corn and expecting it to be able to be broken down in the body to then be digested and gain the nutrition from it. It has to be pre-cooked. We're not herbivores. We don't have rumens. We're not breaking it down like that, and neither are our animals. So it's when they are cooked that they are digestible. And that's another reason why, you know, you can't point to a field of wheat and say, well, would you feed a dog that? No, you wouldn't feed a dog that. You wouldn't feed a cat that. But if you cook it and put it into a pet food, make it bioavailable, then yes, you absolutely can feed animals that, because that nutrition that it contains is now available to them. And this is the sort of nutrition that you get in grains. It's phenomenal, and it's available for both cats and dogs, which is why there's a cat in that picture. You know, it provides energy, the carbohydrates from, you know, simple to complex. Protein sources, like we've discussed, which I think is often underappreciated. Fibre, that vital fibre for that gut health. Essential fatty acids, B vitamins, micronutrients, there's loads in grain. You know, you can feed grain-free if you wish, but obviously that does come with some caveats for heart health. But and there are some animals that, you know, sort of anecdotally appear to do better on grain-free diets, and that's absolutely fine, because that is the amazing thing about the pet food market, is we have all this huge variety, so we really can, you know, individualize our diet recommendation and choices for our animals. We have all these fabulous options available to us, but you know, we shouldn't be inherently worried about feeding grains. Okay, so here's a little bit of bonus information, and this is a slight cul-de-sac, if you will indulge me for a couple of minutes, because when I learned this, it was so interesting and so clinically relevant to my day-to-day life as a vet. I just wanted to spread the word a little bit. So we do get these anecdotal reports relatively frequently of sensitive dogs with sensitive skins improving on, you know, fresh diets or raw diets. And that's fine. You know, if the owner wishes to feed that and the dog is doing well, you know, we're not trying to change minds here. But a lot of atopic dogs, when you do those blood tests and you look at what they're allergic to, an enormous percentage, some 90% plus, are allergic to mites. And there are mites in kibble. There's inevitably, unfortunately, as soon as you open a bag of kibble, it's probably going to get contaminated with food mites to some degree. It's a little bit like how, you know, we've all got dust mites having a lovely time living in our pillows and duvets, and the best thing to do is just not think about it, because it's actually quite grim if you do think about it. You just live alongside them. And those food mites are inevitably in dry food. And that's why, you know, you change the formulation of the diet and some of these dogs will really improve. There may be other factors going on, but, you know, if we can take them down below the allergy threshold by removing food mites from their, to a large extent from their lives, then that actually might, to use a pun, be what's doing it. And so it's one of the reasons why, particularly if we've got allergic dogs, and, you know, especially if we're doing food diet trials, we really need to be encouraging pet owners to keep the food in the original packaging. You know, pet food packaging is a lot cleverer than you think. And so we don't want to be tipping it into plastic bins or, you know, Instagrammable containers. We want to be squeezing the air out of the bag and sealing the bag every time, particularly if we've got a sensitive animal, and that will reduce the number of food mites they're able to get in there. And buying smaller bags, which again can be kind of challenging because some of these hydrolyzed diets are quite expensive. But if we can buy smaller bags, then again, it's time to build up food mites. And I just think it's just really, really interesting, you know, and sort of clinically relevant to me in practice. So I wanted to share that small piece of knowledge with you. Freezing will eliminate for 5 days, but a lot of pet foods have not checked whether the nutritional profile in the diets will stay the same after freezing. So, you know, maybe don't rely on that for 100%, or feed a fresh diet, or feed a canned diet. You know, just feed something that's not kibble, and that might make the change. And that's why sometimes we do see changes in animals on different formulations of diet that aren't maybe canned or kibble. But is it something inherent to that diet, or is it simply how that diet is presented? For example, we can see weight loss, but a lot of those fresh or raw diets are presented in, pre-packaged portions for the day. So that calorie requirement is much more monitored and controlled. And they're also, relatively speaking, a bit more expensive, so you might not overfeed. Healthy coats, you see shiny coats sometimes, but a lot of those diets are sort of quite high in fat in comparison to other formulations. So, and that will definitely trickle down into a lovely shiny coat, which is wonderful. And if, like I say, if animals are doing well and owners are happy, then that's absolutely fine. But the improvement that we're seeing might not be down to the fact that the diet isn't cooked or is only gently cooked. It may well be down to what's in it or how it's presented or how it's packaged, if you see what I mean. But so thank you for indulging my cul-de-sac. I just think that was, as clinicians, I feel that's, it really helped me when I learned it. And of course, we can't talk about grains without talking about dilated cardiomyopathy. There is a strong association between grain-free diets and DCM development in dogs. What we don't have is a causal link. So there is a strong correlation, but currently we have no cause. The FDA stopped giving updates in December 2022. They made this announcement that they were no longer going to update on the issue, which unfortunately some people took to mean that there was no issue and there never was an issue. And that's why they're not continuing to give announcements. That's not the case. The reason why is because although we have extensive research and there's more coming, it wasn't the information that the FDA was able to update us with just wasn't really changing. There is a causal link. If you've got a dog on a grain-free diet and they start to develop heart problems, maybe get them off that grain-free diet. But as currently we don't have any extra information. And of course, it's not the fact that it's grain-free, although that terminology has been used as a shorthand, and I think it's fair that we do use it. It's more likely to be the fact that grains are replaced by legumes, and there's something to do with the peas and the lentils that is impacting on the way the nutrition in that diet. Again, the digestibility of it is getting into the animal, and there's probably some degree of genetic susceptibility in the individual as well, that therefore means that, one dog can eat the food and not have an issue, and another dog eats the food and does. So there's a lot of work to be going on. And if you want to know more, there's a couple of really great Facebook groups about it. Although there's some slightly less than quality information and opinions on Facebook, there is also some absolutely fabulous ones as well, and those groups are linked in the back, and I can highly recommend, if you're interested or want to learn more, that's where I would suggest you go. Right, myth number 7. We're cracking along now, thanks for your patience. Processed foods are the same as fast foods. No, they're not. And I think this is a very lazy comparison I see being made on a relatively regular basis. If you feed your dog that diet, it's just like feeding them McDonald's every day. And again, that pertains into that shaming of pet owners, which I absolutely despise. But of course, it takes 30 seconds of critical thought to think actually there's no comparison between pet foods and fast foods. Pet foods are balanced with healthy fats and calories, all those micronutrients. They're often supplemented with pre and probiotics, essential fatty acids, that fiber that's so important. Whereas really none of those things are true about fast foods. So there really is no equation. And again, I think it's a bit of a red flag when people are discussing nutrition online. That if they make this comparison, then that they really haven't actually critically considered what they are saying, and therefore I would be slightly reluctant to listen to anything else they've got to say. So a better comparison is the complete meal replacements, which again, as far as I'm aware, don't go. The gym bros seem to be quite keen on these complete and balanced meals for humans. Of course, for us, they're quite expensive. And humans have a different need from their food than just eating the same thing every day. But that is the comparison, not fast food. And I think it is arguable to say that the future is here for our pets. So if this guy, some of you watching may well not be old enough to know who he is. So he's called George Jetson, and he's a cartoon character from the 70s and 80s, and he lived in some unimaginably far away time at that stage. I think it's about 2050 or 2060. So George is just around the corner. And then what they envisaged was that all the meals for the humans, they would sit down around the table and say, oh, tonight we'll have spaghetti bolognese. And they pressed a button and a machine would beep and boop. And onto their plate would land this little pill that's in his fingers that contained a complete and balanced meal with everything that they needed, served by their robot butler there. But that was the envisaging of the future, that the food would be, served up in this easy formulation that was, available to all, and that gave great nutrition in one little tiny kibble, if you like. And we certainly don't have that for humans. And obviously there is a lot more psychology that goes into food than just eating a pill 3 times a day. But the future is here for our pets. It's a little bit facetious, but I think the analogy stands. And then, of course, if you want to, you can add fresh to the bowl. I do appreciate, from a pet owner's point of view, that the messaging that comes out of the veterinary world is very different to the messaging that comes out of the human world when it comes to nutrition. Of course, we're encouraging our pet owners to just open the bag, feed a great quality pet food and get on with their day, because all the nourishment is in there, whereas the doctors are very much feed variety, eat fresh, eat the colours of the rainbow. Now, if you want to feed if our clients want to feed a home cooked diet, there's ways and means that we can support them to do that, and I'm coming on to it. But I definitely can see why it seems just so disparate for the two, health related industries in our worlds give such different messaging. And of course, we're dealing with different species, and I'm coming to this point in a minute. However, I do think it's quite reasonable for owners to want to feed some fresh to their pets and to sort of follow those nutritional guidelines and apply them from the medical world and apply them to their animals. So why not? Why not feed some fresh? It's not going to, vegetables are not very calorific. It's probably not going to unbalance the diet. A lot of dogs really like them. There's a lot of enrichment in eating them. If you ever watched a dog rip up a cabbage or chew on a carrot stick. And I think supporting our owners to do something like that is a great and good idea. And then obviously, we talk a lot these days about processed foods, don't we, and how they're bad and ultra processed and all of that jazz. But a processed food is something which has undergone any changes to its natural state. So the vast majority of what we eat and what our pets eat is processed. We need to acknowledge that processing, for example, the grains, and the same for humans, when we eat bread. The nutrition that's in that food therefore becomes far more available. It's also true to say that the cooking process reduces the availability or the presence of some vitamins and minerals, and that's why companies will fortify diets with vitamins and minerals, and why they will quality control, and why they will batch test to ensure that those diets have got everything our pets need. But what they certainly are not, particularly when it comes to kibble, and I again, this is a claim that I hate, burnt brown balls. It just isn't true. In the extrusion process for making kibble, I think it's heated to about 130 degrees, so less than you would bake a cake, for about 2 minutes in order to produce kibble. Yes, there's more processing, but we're certainly not toasting them to a crisp, as is often indicated by, again, people who haven't maybe done the level of research into pet food manufacture that they should. Number 8, home cooking is best. And again, this is this messaging out of the medical field. You must home cook, don't buy things from a manufacturer. But of course, we are different species, and also for humans, food is love, and it's so many other things. You cook a meal to show your appreciation for people, or to show your care for your family, to gather together for social occasions. It's also things like cake on your birthday, or on a Friday when it's been a hard week, or a Wednesday, or a Monday when somebody says, oh, I'm going to the bakery, does anybody want anything? It's the pizza for the team bonding, and again on the Friday or the Saturday night, or when you just can't be bothered to cook, it's the Sunday roast. Food is a lot of other things to humans, and we are in control of our diets, and we're not very good at being in control of our diets. But there is that, that need. We have a desire and a need for variety, which our animals really don't. Again, these scavenging dogs, they'll eat literally anything. But we do cook for ourselves. So why can't we cook for our pets? Why is the veterinary profession so, keen to not have people do that? So we're not very good at cooking for ourselves, is the bottom line. Nutritional related disease is climbing all the time in humans, particularly obesity, but also micronutrient deficiency. There are some stats to show that about half of children under the age of 5 are deficient in some sort of micronutrients, and adult women, about 2/3 of them are macronutrient in some way, which may well include me, and I try really, really hard to eat a complete and balanced and fresh diet and cook for myself every day. So I think that we have to accept that if we are in control, we're probably not doing a terribly good job of it, and we are fairly unlikely to be able to do a much better job of it for our pets. But, we can try if we wish. There's nothing wrong with trying. There are very different requirements, especially for growth. Animals do get one chance to grow, and they've got to do that growing in a year, or maybe a bit longer if they are a giant breed like this Great Dane. And you get one chance to get it right, and it's absolutely vital. And we know so much now about the minutiae of nutrition for supporting and aiding healthy, sensible growth. I just think that the chances of somebody being able to reproduce that with a home cooked diet, or with a diet from a company that maybe isn't backed up by nutritional research, or isn't employing very well qualified nutritionists, is the chances of them achieving that is very low. And there's very few areas as a clinician where I will really put my foot down with pet owners and say, if you do this, it's entirely your prerogative. It's your pet. I can't stop you, and I will support you in decisions and help you make them the best you can. But if you choose to home cook for your giant breed dog, or if you choose to feed a food which is maybe, it's just formulated for everybody, but you just feed the growing animal a certain percentage more, then I will really say, look, I really, really don't think you should do that, because I think that growth is just a vital life stage that we get one chance to get right. If they choose not to take my advice, then I will do my very best to mitigate and support them and help them to do it as best as possible. But it really is one of those points where, particularly for large breed dogs, feed them a complete and balanced large breed puppy food until they're grown, and then you can do whatever you like. But that is just a bit of a red line for me as a vet. And they live a much shorter time, so there's much less opportunity to manage malnutrition. If we home cook for 6 months for a dog who's 6 or 7 and accidentally make them a bit nutritionally deficient, they may look okay on the outside, but that's a very significant proportion of their lives that they've not had good nutrition. This is a 15-year-old teenager here, probably living off Prime and crisps and having the time of her life. She looks absolutely amazing. Look at that skin. She looks fabulous. If we fed that to a 15-year-old Labrador, I'm sure they wouldn't complain. But they probably wouldn't do very well nutritionally. Maybe the teenager's not doing very well nutritionally, but the teenager's able to cope where the 15-year-old Labrador really isn't. So we have to accept that we have less opportunity to get things wrong, or to do a poor job with our animals. And so, but if we're home cooking and I'm following a recipe, says our client, I'm doing it the best I can. Fine. I appreciate your passion and I think you're doing a great job, but let's try to support you. The problem is the vast majority of recipes online are unbalanced. These are some studies that were done, and look at that, 100%, 93% of the recipes, when they looked at them critically, were unbalanced in some shape or form. And these recipes were by a wide variety of people, including veterinary surgeons, but not including board certified veterinary surgeons. Those guys, when their diets are tested, they know what they're doing, that they come out okay. So just simply picking a recipe online and following it does not guarantee, even if it's from someone who calls themselves a nutritionist, does not at all guarantee nutritional completeness. And again, I think that's something which would be very easy to think exactly the opposite. And there's recipe drift and variation. We have all picked up a cookbook and thought, well, I don't have any chicken. Lamb's about the same. I'll just cook the meal with lamb. Or I don't have any flaked almonds, but I have got cashew nuts. I guess they're the same. And again, for a human meal, a one-off, it's not a problem, but on a regular basis, it really is. And this is a really interesting study done by Mike Davis, who's a veterinary nutritionist. And he took veterinary nurses, so trained veterinary professionals, and asked them to create a diet for dogs with renal disease. So a diet that was absolutely vital to get right. And the veterinary nurses obviously understood that, because what we're doing with this diet is supporting disease. So it's absolutely vital this was correct. And every single one of them created a nutritionally different diet. So you can, if they can't manage it, following a recipe created complete and balanced for a disease, then what are the chances of our clients actually managing it? I would argue pretty slim. And of course, if we have an unconventional diet, so we want to create a home-cooked vegan diet or vegetarian or ostrich-based, it's going to be even harder to achieve that. So how can we support? We have clients, we all have them, who want to home cook for their animals. I think that's fair enough. If you want to do it, more power to you. How can we manage it so it is a complete and balanced, healthy diet for your animal that's going to nourish them and keep them well? Because that is exactly what you want. We're not home cooking with the aim of making them sick or doing a bad job. We're home cooking with the aim of doing a really brilliant, caring, amazing job, which is fantastic. I'm all for that. So how can we support them to do it the very best they can? So first of all, we could contact a board certified veterinary nutritionist, of whom there aren't many, but of whom there are in ones that we can contact. The Willows in Solihull in the UK, just outside of Birmingham, have a nutrition service that you can contact. Expert Pet Nutrition, that's Cecilia Villaverde, she's a vet nutritionist. Vets Now have got Marge Chandler, their contact details are all in the back of this talk. The RVC have a nutrition service, and vetspecialist.com is a website where you can see a list of all the board certified and veterinary specialists in the world, and you can select the nutritionists. And a lot of those nutritionists do remote consultations because, of course, it's a specialism that really lends itself to online. So we don't have to restrict ourselves to vets in our own country. We can expand our net on an international basis and put our clients in touch with them, and then they can work together to create some meals for those animals, which I think is completely fair enough. Balance It is a website, this online computer program. It's the one that, as far as I'm aware, the vast majority of nutritionists and pet production companies, if they're just using some sort of computer balancing program, will use. It's very good at what it does, but we as mere mortals can also use it. It has a free login and it's really great. You can go in, you can input the ingredients that your client is using or wants to use, and it will tell you exactly how balanced or unbalanced the meal is. And they do sell, and this is how they make their money, they do sell supplements that will bring the diet up to safe levels of nutrition. But I think it's a great option, and we can send our clients there as well, so they can log on and use it and purchase those supplements directly if they wish. What about commercially prepared home-cooked food? There are lots out there, and it's a growing market. Are any of them hitting the WSAVA guidelines, or all of them? Because I do think as the professionals in the space, we should be aiming for the best quality in our recommendations. We should be always aiming for the top of the tree. Now, I think there's one company in America who are coming very close and doing a brilliant job of creating diets that are coming up to these guidelines. I don't think we have any in the UK at the moment, but on an international basis there may well be more. But I do think it's important that, because it can seem a bit unbending from the vet profession. No, you must only feed this commercially prepared diet. No, you must never home cook. If you're going to feed, you must feed this one. But also, I think if a client came to me and if I said to a client, I think your dog's, dog's got arthritis, let's get them on some painkillers. And they were like, no, I don't want to use those awfully commercially produced painkillers. I know a guy who's done a course online, and he's created a recipe for painkillers in his shed, and he's either going to make them for me or I'm going to make my painkillers at home. I think we'd be slightly horrified by that concept. But I don't think it's too dissimilar from the pet food market. There are pet food companies who are sort of taking that pharmaceutical grade level of science and research and standards and technology and pouring it into the pet food in an affordable and accessible way for pet owners. And so I think that it's completely fair enough for us as the professional, educated leaders in the space to be looking to certain companies as an ideal because of the quality of the products that they produce, and then working with our clients to find an acceptable solution and what works for them. This is a process. We're there to support and to guide and to help and to work as that team, which is what I am so passionate about. A pet nutritionist, what about? There aren't that many board cert vets, and there is a growing need for, or a growing desire by pet owners to produce their own pet food for their animals. So who else could we ask? So unfortunately, I'm not aware that there is any sort of central list of people, which is a real shame. But when it comes to pet nutritionists, we should be looking for a PhD in small animal nutrition or a master's in small animal nutrition backed up by a relevant degree. We should not be looking for any less. And again, I think that there are certain standards to which, as professionals, we have to legitimately adhere if we're going to give the best advice for our pet owners. So if they're going to seek advice from somewhere else, we should be looking for masters or PhD, or we should be saying to them, this is, go out, do some Googling, find some people, but these are the criteria that you really need to be following if someone's going to formulate a diet for you. Are there other people formulating diets? Absolutely. There's loads of them out there. Are some of them educated enough? Possibly. But until they have an objective qualification in the field, I think, I would be counselling clients with caution. Find a different acceptable solution. I mean, like I said before, this is the great thing about the pet food industry and market. And it's also the bad thing about the pet food market is there is a lot of choices available. And we have, this smorgasbord of options, and we can really, nutrition is a science. It's not an opinion, and it can be quite complicated and nuanced. But it also can be quite individualized, and we have that option with loads of, with the commercial options available, we have this wide array of choice, and, working together with pet owners to sort of understand what it is that they want, understanding their concerns or their worries, and working with them to find a diet that suits them, that suits their pets, is an incredibly satisfying part of our job, I think, and one which all of us are capable of doing. This is something which, the vet can do, but also, our amazing nursing colleagues, or even many of our support staff, given the right information, can do as well. And I just think it's a fantastic service, and part of that, really feeds into the passion that we all have for the animals. Number 9, cats can't digest carbohydrates. Oh yes, they can. Cats are indeed carnivores. And they are obligate carnivores, unlike our dogs. But that does not mean that they only should eat meat. And again, I think this is a really common misconception online, because there's a big difference between a physiological and essential need and an ability to digest. And the digestibility of carbohydrates for cats in cat food is really high. Like, we talked about with the grains, it's really, really high. And it's really important to know that there is absolutely no evidence that carbohydrates cause obesity or diabetes in cats. Obesity in cats is caused by excessive calories, and diabetes in cats is caused by obesity. So calories cause obesity, and obesity causes diabetes. So carbs have absolutely nothing to do with either problem. And you will often hear it said that animals have no need for carbohydrates. They're not an essential nutrient. And that is indeed true. But again, because it's not essential, it doesn't follow that it's not digestible or they're not useful. And carbohydrates are not this monolith of just, it's carbs and it's bad. They're those simple carbohydrates of the sugars that provide easily metabolizable energy, all up to those complex carbohydrates, those slow release carbs, and the starch and the dietary fiber. So, again, if you hear somebody say carbs aren't essential and therefore they're not needed, they're only half true. They're only half right. Indeed, they are not essential, and indeed they are not needed, but that does not follow that they are somehow bad or harmful or useless in pet foods. So yes, don't listen to that. Right, and finally, we made it to the end, because of course you know nothing about pet nutrition. Vet professionals don't know anything about pet food, and I just think this is a really unfortunate myth that seems very pervasive, and I think it's done because our opinions about pet food often, unfortunately, don't align with popular opinions about pet food. So rather than try to talk with us and liaise with us and find out what our opinions are and why as a profession we're saying what we are, it's much easier to discount us and belittle us, which I just think is a true shame. Hopefully after this talk you do a little bit more, but nutrition is such a fundamental part of our training for both health and both disease. I sometimes think we don't notice that it's there, because we all know more than we think. And I think if any client came to you as a vet professional and asked questions about any of these subjects, or maybe many more, as part of a good and detailed discussion about that, food is going to come into it, particularly as it pertains to things like disease. And we can do such a lot of heavy lifting for illness now with diets, and it's absolutely phenomenal what we can do with just the food that we're feeding animals. And for seniors, for after they've been neutered, for pregnancy, for weight, obviously, and then I think behaviour is this massively fascinating field, where we're going to learn an awful lot more in the coming years about that gut health and how we can support it through diet to therefore support behaviour. What we can't do is formulate diets. And I think this is another place where that misconception comes in, you know, because if somebody said to me, well, I want to home cook for my dog, and can you create a recipe? I would say, well, no, it's a really specialist skill. I can't do cataract surgery or spinal surgery. I have colleagues who are brilliant at that and have worked really hard and done extra qualifications, are absolutely fantastic. And if you need that service, I will refer you very happily into their care. And then I can look after you afterwards. And it's exactly the same for diets. You know, I think there is this misconception that because people who are nutritionists online claim to be able to formulate diets for health and much more concerningly for illness, that, you know, because a vet can't do it, or a vet says they don't want to do it or don't have the knowledge to do it, then therefore we don't know anything about nutrition because the guy in his shed or the guy with his website says that he can do it. So obviously vets don't know anything because they're saying they can't do it. The old Dunning-Kruger effect is in full force here. But we do know a lot more than we think. But we don't get taught things that aren't a thing. And I think this is a big part of the problem with the online space and why it seems like we don't know or care about nutrition, because a lot of these rumours that we've discussed and these myths that we've discussed in this talk are, you know, sort of discussed very factually online. And then as trained scientists and medical professionals, when somebody says, well, I mean, obviously cats can't eat carbohydrates, it's absolutely dreadful, it's in pet food, you know, we think, gosh, well, I was never taught that cats can't have carbohydrates, so maybe there's some truth to that. But we aren't taught cats can't have carbohydrate because cats can have carbohydrate. We aren't taught to avoid meat and animal derivatives in pet food because meat and animal derivatives in pet food are a perfectly fine, safe and nutritious thing to have. We have got enough time in our courses, we've got enough to learn in our courses of things that are a thing, that we aren't taught things that aren't a thing. We're not taught in the negative. And I think that then sort of can leave us a bit like, gosh, this is what pet owners online are saying, this is what people online are saying, maybe it's I don't know this, maybe it's true. We're all, if this profession does nothing if not keep you humble and curious and always keen to learn more. And honestly, that's where I started, with people making statements like this and me thinking, gosh, I'd better go out and find out a bit more, and so I did. And, you know, here's this presentation which I hope you've really enjoyed. And our role, our fundamental, you know, purpose for being in the vet profession is to support and guide pet owners and their pets and help them do the very best for them within what they wish to do. You know, it's all very individualized. And so being able to discuss nutrition is a very, very important part of what we do. It can be easy to shy away from those discussions, again, which I think feeds into this narrative that we don't know or care, because we don't want to upset clients. And if clients have got some very firm and fixed ideas about diet, that's fine. It really is fine. We can help you and support you with whatever you want. But, you know, sometimes when you bring up the conversation, some people do get very defensive, and none of us want to upset anybody. We all want to be able to work with our clients. But I think, you know, the pendulum, I think, sometimes has swung just a little bit too far in they're like, we don't discuss diet because it's just, it's too, everybody just gets too het up. And if we can see that pendulum swing back a little bit and we can engage a bit more with clients in real life, and maybe a little tiny bit, if you're feeling brave, online as well, I think that would be awesome, because we've got such a lot to give and so much passion. So thank you so much for listening. I'm absolutely delighted that you stuck with me to the end of the course. Here are some of the links to papers and articles for the back of the statements that I've made. And here are some useful resources if you want to know a little bit more about nutrition, or some of the resources that I've mentioned through the talk. These are some of my happy places online and places that I go if I've got some questions that I want to, you know, learn from a reputable and educated source. So thank you very much for listening. I'm delighted that you stuck with me. I really hope you enjoyed that. If you've got any questions, please do reach out. You can find me as Kat the Vet on pretty much any social media platform. I'm always very happy to discuss this. I might not reply immediately. Sometimes I'm a bit slow to reply to messages, but if you message, you know, I will do my very best to get back to you. And if you've got any questions about, you know, the Purina diets or that, obviously their guys are absolutely amazing. And thanks again for allowing me to take the time to do this talk for you. But everything I have said is completely independent of them. They had zero input in it, but I am very grateful that they gave me the time. So thank you so much for listening, everybody. I hope you have a great day.